Okay, so this is the study guide for exam 2 for gender. Okay, so for the first part from chapter 6, what I mean by misplaced nostalgia is something we were talking about that, people often have this romanticized notion of the past, especially the 1950s, this idealized family. But the research in the book showed that when people were interviewed and asked about their own childhoods, they tended to remember it much more nostalgically than it actually was. So even at the time period when this 1950s ideal was created, it was not the reality for most families, right? Okay, so then when it comes to the family values thing, it's the idea that a lot of today's current debate over family values is a thinly veiled attack on feminism because it encourages traditional gender roles and the ideology of separate spheres that men work outside the home, women work inside the home, and argues that women who work, go to school, play sports, or run for office destroy the family as a social institution. As far as economic changes, um, that's kind of straightforward. Economic changes change the nature of work for men and women, meaning that technology industrialized processes that people had done previously in the home. So men's work around the home was industrialized so they could work outside of the home, right? And women and children were the ones who then took over the rest of the kind of house. Oh, the cultural definition of marriage, just that idea that a woman has to trap a man to get married, right? Um, when it comes to children and happiness, couples without children report higher levels of happiness than couples with children. Children learn gendered expectations often through the practice of chores that may be different for boys and girls. So they learn those gendered expectations from their families. Um, this problem of daycare is the fact that it's so expensive in some states that it's more than college tuition. That middle class families and poor families often struggle to pay for it so that they can work, and that's a problem. The issue of babies having babies is really what I want you to know about that is the fact that the birth rate in this country has been dropping or the teen birth rate has been dropping since 1990. But rates of teen pregnancy are still much higher than those in other developed nations. Um, let's see, fatherlessness. What I want you to think about there is how it relates to structural forces. So the fact that unemployment is pretty high, that there's increased workplace demands on trying to maintain a standard of living can be part of the reason that fatherlessness is such an issue right now. So if you basically essentialize men as breadwinners to be men and you make it very difficult for people to have economic success, then their likelihood of being in that role is very strongly diminished. Okay, so for gay and lesbian families, what I want you to know there is that same-sex marriage has expanded the definition of marriage, but it hasn't radically changed the social institution of marriage. We still think of it in very heteronormative ways. Let's see, when it comes to at-home fathers and breadwinning mothers, the idea that stay-at-home fathers are judged more harshly than stay-at-home mothers because they challenge those traditional gender roles that portray women as better suited for child rearing and portray men as better suited for the world of work. And then when it comes to reversing, conflicting, collaborating, improvising, and sharing, these were all those different techniques that families took on. So I kind of wanted you to know the fundamental of what makes them different. So for reversing, that just meant a performance of non-traditional homemaking and money-making tasks. It was pretty much just kind of like flipping the script with each other. Let's see. Conflicting was couples that describe having different meanings for the performance of work and family responsibilities. So that was the couples where men decided to stay home as the path of least resistance, right? For collaborating families, those are the ones that recognize the existing gender assumptions, but they desire to transgress those boundaries. For those who improvise, it's really interesting. They did not use gender as the measure for who should do what in regards to child and home care. It was much more of like a financial decision. And so in that way, um, improvising challenged traditional gender assumptions of who should be doing what. Um, let's see. Sharing is constructed through the language of co-providing or co-caring. So, that was the couple that said they're both the primary breadwinner and they are both the primary caregiver, right? Okay, so moving on to chapter 9. Let's see, women's increase in labor force participation. So really all I want you to know there is that in the next decade, 80% of new laborers will be women, minorities, and immigrants. This issue of do men work longer and harder than women, we talked about, no, not nationally or globally. Let's see. Oh, emotion work. The idea that a lot of jobs for women revolve around emotion work. That we talked about the idea that, making sure male to male interactions are smooth and unmistakably heterosexual. So we talked about, if you're in a boxing ring, in between each bout, you have a woman in a bikini walk around, right? That would definitely be a version of emotion work. Subtle sexism takes place in the world of work in a lot of ways. Remember, I talked about this in class, but your book goes into like several different ways. So I just kind of want you to, know some of those ways. So some of the ones that I'm focusing on are condescending chivalry, where a boss withholds helpful criticism in order to not hurt a woman's feelings. Subjective objectification, believing that all women are some stereotype. Collegial exclusion, where you schedule meetings at times when parents have family responsibilities, like really early or really late or over weekends. Benevolent exploitation, so giving a woman the opportunity to work on a project, but then taking credit for her work. So those were a couple examples I wanted you to know for subtle sexism. Gender discrimination, what I want you to know about that is that it's often compounded by other factors, such as race or sexual orientation. Sex segregation, just the definition for that one, refers to women and men's concentration in different occupations, jobs, and levels within work hierarchies. Same thing with wage gap, just the definition. The wage gap refers to the differences in wages between men and women, largely due to stereotypes. Let's see. Oh, the glass ceiling is a phenomenon where women are prevented from advancing in their careers to higher paid positions or higher level positions, right? They hit this invisible wall. And then the kind of opposite of that, though we talked about briefly, is the glass cellar. This idea where men are often concentrated in hazardous and dangerous occupations that, we also talked about how gender and sex segregation kind of factors into that, as well as a lot of those professions did not include women for many years, hence why men are concentrated there. Anyway, let's see. Sexual harassment, super vague. What I want from you there is, just different examples of sexual harassment that we talked about in class. So catcalling, right? We watched that hilarious video. The Anita Hill case, right, that we talked about. And then the two different kinds of harassment that we talked about in class. The I can never say it. Quid pro quo harassment, where bosses will either threaten to fire someone or maybe, offer to promote them in exchange for sexual favors. Or hostile work environment, where workplaces, are made to make employees feel really degraded and uncomfortable. So those are kind of what I want you to focus on as far as sexual harassment. The Family Medical Leave Act, all I'm asking you there is that it was passed in 1993 and offers 12 weeks of unpaid leave for, a family or child. Let's see. When it comes to racializing the glass escalator, that's pretty much the answer right there. Jobs are sex segregated, which creates different occupational experiences. So that's that. The glass escalator model, right? We talked about this a lot. The idea that men are perceived as competent, more so than women in female-dominated fields. And so that means that men often experience an easier entry into higher paid or higher status positions. So they get moved up, right? So it's kind of the opposite of the glass ceiling. Let's see, tokens. So again, just the definition from your book, they're people who are seen as different from the majority and often stereotyped by the majority group. And gender racism just means that stereotypes about race are grounded in images and beliefs about gender. So it's kind of that intersectionality, that those things are related. So black men are stereotyped as violent and threatening, particularly to white women. And so this affected how black male nurses were understood in terms of their race and gender. Okay, let's see, chapter 10. Okay, so that one's pretty much the answer right there too. In 2012, the US ranked 84th in the world in percentage of female legislators. That's going to be a true or false. A gender gap in voting. Just what that means, that women are more likely to vote Democrat and men are more likely to vote Republican, and the fact that women tend to hold more liberal views than men. Let's see, masculinity in presidential elections, just the idea that masculinity is almost the most apparent in our presidential politics. It's apparent in politics, but especially in our presidential politics. We talked about, Van Buren and William Henry Harrison and all that kind of fun stuff, and just how that's really affected us in the modern day. So the idea that gender is an identity but also a set of processes means that, gender is something that's very embedded in the institutions and institutional logics of our society. What does it mean that the personal is political? Just that how we live our everyday life is affected by gender differences and gender inequality. So that, our routine activities of housework or what you watch, how you have sex, how you raise your children, are going to be affected by the kind of larger cultural politics. And feminism is the, ideological belief in the social, political, and economic equality between men and women. Pretty straightforward. And then when it comes to the last reading we had, women in leadership positions, just this idea that they're considered to be transgressing their gender norms because, these leadership positions are typically gendered to be male. So women tend to be judged a little harsher when it comes to these leadership positions than men. And part of this comes from this idea of gender role incongruency theory, which, we talked about in that reading. So that really argues that when women work in leadership positions, people consider her negatively and see her actions as too masculine. And this idea of how Hillary became more human and popular, it's pretty sad. Not because of her education, not because of her position as First Lady, but because she was humiliated by her husband's sexual affairs. So that's the answer to that one. Okay, and then when it comes to these short answer essays, how are laws that restrict the rights of transgender people gender-based discrimination? And what are some of the ways policies affect the transgender community? There are some examples in your book of specific policies and how they affect the community, so I'd advise you to go over that as far as what specific examples you want to, contribute. But as far as how is this gender-based discrimination, it's pretty straightforward. The idea that, we know that if someone goes from, is going from female to male, but yet in their job position, they're able to go up in pay and status when they're in their job from switching from female to male versus people that go male to female that often get fired, often, receive less money, often kind of immediately get affected by that. It shows that no matter who you are and occupying what identity, these gendered ideas about men and women affect, what kind of opportunities and rights people have. So again, in your book, there's some specific policies and examples, but I mean like one that you could definitely include is the fact that there are no national protections in the workplace for transgender people. Like you can be fired for being trans. So you kind of want to elaborate on how those policies affect transgender community. Okay, and then in regards to the film we watched in class, Makers, Women in Politics. So what type of obstacles do American women face in finding opportunities in politics? So again, that kind of stuff we've been talking about throughout, the gendered perceptions that male leaders are more effective, the historical nature, the fact that women were excluded for a long period of time, and like they showed in Makers, there were a lot of women that even when they were able to ascend to these political offices, because the majority of people there were male, they were often marginalized or not listened to or excluded. And so, not just is it within office itself, but also in getting funding or getting support or getting name recognition, very difficult for women in politics. So anything like that, and you're going to get credit. So that's basically all I want you to know for that. And if you have any specific questions, let me know.